So today we are going to see experiment 10, which states like this: write a program to implement the concept of threading by extending thread class. Now, as we have already studied, what is a thread? A thread is a sub-process which is used to bring concurrency. So of course, using thread, we can increase the CPU utilization properly and effectively. So in this experiment, we would see how to create threads. Before we start, thread is a class which is a subclass of object. Thread has its own constructors and methods. So in the upcoming program, we would see how to create threads by using constructors and its methods. The first and foremost point to remember is, in order to create a thread, I should create a new class which extends the thread class. So in the program that is seen on the screen, we have a class known as new thread 1, which is responsible to create threads. That is why we have written class name extends thread class. Now inside this class, which is responsible for creation of thread, we should write one of the method of thread which is known as run, and which is equally responsible for every action of thread to get executed. The class which extends thread is responsible to create the run method. So as class new thread 1 extends thread, inside this class we have written the run method, which describes what kind of action would our thread do. In this program, as I have mentioned, I am going to create threads by extending the thread class. So to begin with, first create a class which extends the thread class, inside which I should have the run method. Now, as we already know, by default, implicitly there exists one thread which gets created by itself, which is known as the main thread. In this program, the another class known as new thread, which contains the main method, is responsible for the creation of another thread. Thus, this program creates two different threads, one created by class new thread 1, which extends the thread class, and the other thread is created by class new thread, which is your main thread. So in this program, we will see how we are creating two different threads, the child thread and the main thread, using two different classes. Now, before we start, I want to list very important point here. So the first step we have already seen. Second step, what we are supposed to do. Once if I have created a class which extends thread class, secondly, we should create the object of that class. So class new thread 1 is the class which extends the thread. Therefore, in the main, we would create an object of new thread 1. Using this object, we will call. So here, instead of creating the object, we are calling the constructor. This statement calls the constructor of the class which extends thread. So the call goes here. Now, as I said, the thread class contains constructors and methods. Here, the thread class constructor that we have used is thread, which contains runnable R and string name. This is the constructor that we have used for the thread class. And the method that we have used of the thread class is a run method. So when I call the constructor new thread 1, it will implicitly call the thread class constructor, which actually creates an object T. So T is an object of thread class, and using a method known as start. So start is a method which is equally responsible for the execution of a thread. So in order for a thread to start its beginning life cycle, we should call the start method. So t.start starts the execution of a thread. Now t.start indirectly calls the run method, which is responsible for the action to be performed by the thread that has been created. So when t.start is called, a run method would be implicitly called by the JVM. We'll again go back to the main function. So what we have done is, first we call the constructor. The constructor will create an object of thread, and using .start method, I will execute the run method. Now inside the run method, we are going to perform some action of the thread. That means one thread has been created. The name of the thread was child thread. Now what is here, what we are doing? We are doing some action of the thread. We are just printing the number of threads that has been created for that particular child. So if you could see, we are here executing a loop. So initially child thread 5 would be printed. Then using thread.sleep, which is another method of the thread class, which is equally responsible to cause a delay for the thread. So after I print child thread 5, it will go to rest and come back after 0.3 millisecond, after 0.3 seconds. After 0.3 seconds, it will print child thread 4. After again a delay of 0.3 seconds, it will print child thread 3. After a gap of the delay, it will again print child thread 2. Once it has completed its execution, it will say that the child thread is exiting. So the child thread will exit when it reaches 1. Now, as I have mentioned, here we have two classes. Class new thread 1, which extends the thread class, and we have the main class known as new thread. Now, the main class is also responsible to create another thread known as main thread, which also prints main thread 5 times with a delay of 0.05 seconds. So, if you could see, there is a concurrency that would appear during the execution. So, initially, when this constructor gets called, it actually creates the child thread. The first loop of the child thread gets executed. It calls a sleep method, during which the main thread gets executed. Let us see the execution of this program. As you could see in the output screen, first we started with the child thread. It goes to sleep condition. Meanwhile, main thread gets executed. When main thread is allowed to sleep, concurrently the child thread gets executed. So there is a context switch that is happening, which is an important concept of threading. So as we have earlier mentioned, threading is used to bring concurrency. Threading can be implemented via two ways. One way is create a class which extends the thread class. Another way of implementing thread is using a runnable interface. So in this experiment, we have seen how to create a class which extends thread class, how to use constructors of the thread class and methods of the thread class. The constructor of the thread class that we have used is having two parameters. One is the object, which is the current reference, and the name of the thread. The method that we have used under this program of thread class is start method, which is equally responsible to start the execution of the thread, and which explicitly calls the run method, which is responsible for performing action related to thread. So two methods we have used under the thread class. The third method that we have used under the thread class is a sleep method, which causes the thread to sleep for milliseconds. So when a thread sleeps for a few seconds, concurrently, another thread comes into action. As the second thread that we have created is under main, of course, the last thread that would be exiting would be the main thread. Thank you.